Grief did not arrive in Will Spencer's life as a single, shattering moment and then politely retreat into memory. It lingered. It settled into the corners of his days, into the pauses between breaths, into the quiet spaces where Luna's presence used to exist. Even when the world moved forward, even when people around him insisted that time would dull the pain, Will discovered that loss had its own rhythm, one that refused to be rushed or reasoned with. Luna's death, and the loss of the child they had never been allowed to meet, remained suspended in his mind like an unfinished sentence, one that echoed endlessly no matter how hard he tried to close the chapter. He told himself he was healing. On the surface, he functioned. He showed up. He answered questions. He returned to routines that felt hollow but necessary. Yet every night, when the noise of the day finally faded, Luna returned with merciless clarity. He saw her smile as it had been before everything fractured, felt the weight of her hand in his, remembered the plans they had spoken aloud and the ones they had only dared to imagine. Grief did not scream. It whispered, insinuating itself into even the most ordinary moments, turning the act of survival into a quiet act of endurance. It was during one of those attempts at normalcy that the past refused to remain buried. Will had been sorting through old boxes, the kind no one wants to open but eventually must, remnants of a life that no longer existed. He told himself it was practical, that clearing space might also clear his mind. Instead, his hands closed around something that made his breath catch painfully in his throat. A small envelope, worn at the edges, tucked between forgotten papers as if it had been deliberately hidden. Inside it lay a letter written in Luna's unmistakable handwriting, accompanied by a small object he recognized instantly, a personal keepsake she had once claimed was meaningless, something she had carried long before she ever met him. The moment Will saw her handwriting, the careful slant of each letter, the world tilted. He sank onto the floor without realizing it, the box spilling forgotten items around him as his attention narrowed to the fragile paper in his hands. Reading Luna's words felt like crossing a forbidden threshold, as if he were intruding on something she had never intended for him to see. Yet the letter was addressed to no one and to everyone, written in a voice that was raw, unguarded, stripped of the manipulation and defensiveness that had defined so much of her public life. At first, the letter read like a confession, an attempt to make sense of her own contradictions. Luna wrote about fear, about the weight of choices made too young and secrets kept too long. She wrote about wanting to be better, about loving fiercely even when she did not know how to love safely. Will felt tears blur his vision as he read, his chest tightening with the familiar ache of loss. Then he reached the part that changed everything. Luna wrote of a pregnancy that did not belong to the narrative Will thought he understood. She spoke not only of the child they had lost together, but of another life, another child she had carried in secrecy, one she had been forced to hide long before her world collided with his. The words were careful, evasive, but unmistakable. She wrote of a choice that had been taken from her, of people who had decided her fate before she had the strength to decide it herself. She wrote of fear so overwhelming that silence had felt safer than truth. And she wrote, with a clarity that made Will's hands tremble, that this child might still exist. The letter did not explain everything. It offered fragments, hints, half-formed confessions that raised more questions than answers. But the implication was impossible to ignore. Luna had not been only the woman Will loved, nor only the woman the world had condemned. She had been a mother, or something close enough to it to shatter everything he thought he knew. As Will sat there, the letter trembling in his grasp, grief transformed into something sharper, more dangerous. Shock gave way to disbelief, disbelief to obsession. The past had not finished with him yet. The discovery pulled Will into a journey he had never intended to take. He did not announce his questions publicly, did not confront his family immediately. Instead, he moved quietly, driven by a need he could not articulate to understand the truth Luna had carried alone. Each step he took felt like a betrayal of the fragile peace he had begun to build, yet ignoring the letter felt like a deeper betrayal still. He owed Luna that much, if nothing else. As Will followed the threads Luna had left behind, he encountered people who existed at the margins of her past, names that had never surfaced during their time together. Some were reluctant, guarded by years of fear and resentment. Others seemed almost relieved to speak, as if the secret had weighed on them too heavily for too long. With every conversation, Will's image of Luna grew more complex. She was no longer a simple figure of tragedy or manipulation, but a woman shaped by pressures far larger than herself, by systems that punished vulnerability and rewarded silence. The possibility of a child sent shockwaves through the Spencer and Nozawa families the moment it became impossible to contain. What began as whispers escalated into open confrontation, suspicions spreading like a contagion. Old wounds reopened, alliances strained under the weight of new uncertainty. Some questioned Luna's motives even in death, framing the letter as another calculated move designed to destabilize those she left behind. Others, particularly those who had witnessed the cruelty of her circumstances, began to question whether the narrative of Luna as purely destructive had ever been fair. Legal implications emerged almost immediately, turning grief into strategy and sorrow into calculation. If a child existed, questions of custody, inheritance, and legitimacy followed with ruthless efficiency. Lawyers spoke in measured tones about rights and obligations, while emotions ran dangerously close to the surface. The possibility of a legal battle loomed, threatening to tear open families already fractured by years of mistrust. For Will, the idea that this child could become a bargaining chip was unbearable, transforming his search for truth into a mission of protection. As the truth edged closer to the surface, Will found himself confronting not only Luna's legacy, but his own. He questioned his memories, his assumptions, the ease with which he had categorized her as victim or villain, depending on the moment. The child's existence complicated everything. It demanded a reevaluation of Luna not as a symbol of chaos, but as a human being navigating impossible choices. It forced Will to acknowledge that love and harm had coexisted within her, that redemption and failure were not mutually exclusive. The moment the child's identity finally emerged was not dramatic in the way Will had imagined. There was no grand reveal, no cinematic confrontation. Instead, it arrived quietly, devastating in its simplicity. Seeing the child, knowing what they represented, shattered the distance Will had tried to maintain. The resemblance was not physical but emotional, an echo of Luna's presence that cut through him with startling force. In that instant, the abstract became real, and the weight of legacy settled squarely on his shoulders. Will's internal conflict reached its breaking point. Accepting the child meant accepting Luna's complexity, embracing a future that would forever bind him to her past. It meant inviting chaos back into his life, risking the fragile stability he had fought so hard to regain. Refusing the child promised safety, predictability, and the illusion of closure. But it also meant turning away from something undeniably innocent, something that had already endured loss before it could even understand its meaning. The families watched, waited, judged. Some urged caution, others compassion. No one could make the decision for him. In the end, Will understood that whatever choice he made would redefine him. This was not about obligation or guilt alone. It was about the man he wanted to be in the aftermath of love and loss. Luna's letter had not only revealed a secret, it had handed him a crossroads. Standing at that crossroads, Will realized that grief had never truly been about what he lost, but about what he was being asked to carry forward. The child was not an answer, not a resolution, but a continuation. And as painful as that truth was, it was also undeniable. The past could not be undone. But the future, fragile and uncertain, still waited to be shaped by courage rather than fear. The arrival of the stranger in Los Angeles did not come with spectacle or announcement, yet it unsettled the city in ways few public scandals ever had. There was no press conference, no dramatic entrance into the lives of the powerful families whose names dominated the fashion houses, legal offices, and legacy empires of the city. Instead, the disturbance began quietly, almost invisibly, with a name whispered in the right places and a presence that felt deliberately measured, as though every step had been planned long before the plane ever touched the ground. The stranger claimed no fame, sought no immediate attention, and yet carried something far more dangerous than notoriety: knowledge. Knowledge rooted deeply in the past of Luna, knowledge that refused to stay buried, knowledge capable of reshaping everything the Forrester, Logan, and Spencer families believed they understood about her life and her death. From the moment this figure appeared, the fragile equilibrium that had begun to form after Luna's passing cracked again. For months, grief had been slowly settling into something resembling acceptance. The rawness of loss had dulled just enough for people to breathe without flinching at the sound of her name. Investigations into Luna's death, though never entirely resolved, had grown quiet, constrained by a lack of concrete evidence and the collective exhaustion of families desperate to move forward. But the stranger's arrival reopened wounds that had never truly healed, transforming uncertainty into suspicion and memory into accusation. What made this person so unsettling was not merely the claim of intimacy with Luna's past, but the calm certainty with which it was delivered. The stranger spoke of Luna not as an abstract figure or a cautionary tale, but as someone known intimately, observed closely, understood in ways others had never been allowed to see. They described moments from her life that were not public, decisions she had made far from the reach of cameras, family scrutiny, or courtroom narratives. These were not rumors repeated for attention, but recollections layered with detail, too precise to be invented, too personal to be coincidence. The implication was unmistakable. This person had been there, had watched, and had chosen silence until now. For those who had loved Luna, the stranger's presence felt like a violation. For those who had feared or distrusted her, it felt like confirmation that the story was far from complete. And for those who had spent years shaping narratives to protect reputations and legacies, it was a threat of the highest order. Because truth, when it arrives late and uninvited, does not ask permission before it rearranges everything. The investigation into Luna's death, once dormant, stirred back to life almost immediately. Law enforcement officials who had quietly filed the case away found themselves revisiting old evidence with fresh unease. Timelines that had once appeared settled now felt suspiciously thin. Decisions previously attributed to impulse or emotional instability began to look calculated, perhaps even coerced. The stranger did not accuse outright, did not offer neat conclusions. Instead, they presented fragments, observations, moments that forced investigators to ask questions they had previously avoided. Who had benefited most from Luna's silence? Who had been present in the final weeks of her life? And most unsettling of all, who had ensured that her voice would never be heard again? Within the Forrester family, the stranger's appearance reignited a familiar sense of dread. They had spent decades navigating scandals, betrayals, and tragedies, always emerging bruised but intact, protected by wealth, influence, and a carefully curated image of resilience. Luna had been one of the few disruptions they could not fully control, a figure who refused to fit neatly into their narratives. Her death had offered a grim kind of closure, allowing unresolved questions to fade into the background. Now, that closure was unraveling. Ridge, who had seen too many storms tear through his family, felt the familiar tightening in his chest as word of the stranger spread. He understood instinctively that this was not simply about Luna, but about the past catching up to choices that had once seemed necessary. He worried not only about what might be revealed, but about how those revelations would affect the people he loved, particularly those already struggling under the weight of guilt, grief, and regret. The idea that Luna's story might be far more complex and far more damning than anyone had admitted unsettled him deeply. Brooke, whose history with Luna had been fraught with mistrust and reluctant empathy, reacted differently. The stranger's claims stirred a painful sense of déjà vu, reminding her how often women like Luna were reduced to symbols rather than understood as people shaped by circumstance and pressure. Brooke feared that whatever truths emerged would once again divide families along familiar fault lines, pitting compassion against self-preservation, honesty against denial. Yet she also felt an undeniable pull toward the truth, a belief that silence, however comforting, ultimately destroyed more than it protected. For the Logan family, the stranger's arrival reopened old conflicts that had never been fully resolved. Luna's impact on their lives had been profound, leaving behind emotional wreckage that no amount of distance could erase. The suggestion that Luna's actions before her death had been witnessed, perhaps even influenced, by someone who had remained hidden felt like a betrayal layered atop existing pain. Questions arose not only about Luna's choices, but about the systems and relationships that had shaped them. The idea that someone had watched her struggle and said nothing ignited anger and sorrow in equal measure. The Spencer family felt the tremors most violently. For them, Luna was not just a tragic figure from the periphery. She was a wound that had never closed, a loss intertwined with guilt, love, and unfinished responsibility. Will, still grappling with the revelations left behind by Luna's letter and the existence of a child that altered his understanding of her entirely, found himself thrust back into turmoil. The stranger's knowledge threatened to destabilize the fragile sense of purpose he had begun to build around protecting that legacy. He wondered whether this person knew about the child, whether they had been present during moments that could redefine everything he believed about Luna's final choices. The stranger did not rush to reveal everything at once. Instead, they allowed information to surface gradually, each detail carefully placed to maximize its impact. They spoke of Luna's fear in her final months, of her growing sense of entrapment, of conversations that hinted at pressure from forces larger than herself. They described Luna not as a manipulator or victim alone, but as someone caught in a web of expectations and threats, struggling to assert control in a world that had already decided who she was allowed to be. These accounts complicated the simplistic narratives that had dominated public perception, forcing listeners to confront uncomfortable ambiguities. As these revelations spread, suspicion intensified. Old alliances were tested as family members questioned one another's roles, their past decisions, their silences. Innocent interactions were re-examined through a lens of doubt, every kindness or conflict scrutinized for hidden motives. The stranger's mere presence created a climate of paranoia, where the absence of certainty felt as dangerous as guilt itself. People began to wonder whether Luna's death had truly been the result of her own despair, or whether despair had been engineered, nurtured, and exploited. Legal ramifications soon followed. Attorneys began to circle, drawn by the possibility of reopened cases, wrongful death claims, and revelations that could reshape inheritance, custody, and public accountability. The stranger's testimony, if deemed credible, had the potential to transform speculation into evidence. Yet credibility itself became a battleground. Who is this person really? Why come forward now? And what did they stand to gain? These questions echoed in boardrooms and living rooms alike, fueling debates that blurred the line between justice and self-interest. For Will, the stranger represented both threat and possibility. Threat because the truth they carried could expose vulnerabilities he was still struggling to protect, particularly where the child was concerned. Possibility because the stranger might also hold answers Luna had been unable to leave behind, context that could humanize her beyond the extremes of condemnation and idealization. Will found himself drawn into reluctant conversations, listening carefully, searching for sincerity beneath the measured words. He recognized in the stranger a familiar tension, the burden of knowing too much and the fear of being destroyed by it. Emotionally, the city itself seemed to respond to the disruption. Los Angeles, so accustomed to reinvention and illusion, suddenly felt heavier, its glitter dulled by the weight of unresolved truth. The families at the center of the storm moved through their days with heightened awareness, conscious that any misstep could be magnified under the scrutiny now building. Public appearances became calculated, statements carefully worded, silences louder than words. Behind closed doors, however, the facade cracked, revealing fear, anger, and a deep longing for certainty in a situation that offered none. The stranger's impact extended beyond the investigation itself, altering relationships in subtle but irreversible ways. Trust eroded where it had once seemed unbreakable, replaced by guarded interactions and unspoken accusations. Some family members began revisiting their memories of Luna, questioning whether they had truly known her or merely the version of her that fit their needs. Others clung desperately to familiar narratives, resisting any suggestion that their understanding might have been incomplete or self-serving. At the heart of it all lay a single, haunting question. Who is Luna, really? Was she the manipulator some believed her to be, orchestrating chaos until the end? Was she a victim crushed by forces beyond her control? Or was she something far more complicated, a woman navigating impossible circumstances with limited choices, leaving behind fragments of truth that refused to assemble into a single, comforting image? The stranger did not offer definitive answers, only evidence that the question itself had been wrong all along. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that the stranger's arrival marked a turning point not only in the search for truth, but in the moral landscape of the families involved. Choices made years ago, justified at the time by necessity or fear, now stood exposed to scrutiny. The cost of silence, once perceived as protective, revealed itself as corrosive, eroding integrity and trust from within. Each revelation forced the families to confront not just what had happened to Luna, but how their own actions or inactions had contributed to the outcome. The stranger, meanwhile, remained an enigma. They revealed just enough to maintain momentum, yet withheld details that suggested deeper layers still concealed. Their motives remained unclear, oscillating between a desire for justice and something more personal, perhaps even redemptive. Some speculated that guilt drove them, that silence had become unbearable. Others suspected calculation, believing the stranger sought leverage or absolution through exposure. The truth, like Luna herself, resisted simplification. In the end, the stranger's presence ensured that Luna's story could no longer be dismissed as finished. Her death, once framed as tragic but contained, expanded into a broader reckoning with power, responsibility, and the human cost of secrecy. The Forrester, Logan, and Spencer families found themselves bound together once more by a shared crisis, forced to navigate not only external investigation but internal reflection. Whatever truths emerged would reshape their futures, whether they welcomed that transformation or fought it with every resource at their disposal. And so Los Angeles held its breath, suspended between revelation and denial, as the stranger's shadow stretched across lives already marked by loss. In that uneasy pause, one truth became inescapable. The past does not remain silent simply because it is inconvenient. It waits. And when it returns, it demands to be seen, no matter the cost.